Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. Today, I am very happy to have two great people, Peter Wallace and Karin Litzcke. I don't know if I pronounced that right.
That's good.
And we're talking about gender ideology in schools, and we have different perspectives. And I'm very happy to say that Peter and Karin are both able to bring in their expertise. They've been in the gender politics and all of this for a lot longer than I have. So I just want to take the time over here, welcome them one at a time. Peter, welcome. If you want to say something a little bit about yourself and if you're a part of any group.
Sure. So again, thank you for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm the developer of a website called blueprintforcanada.ca. I also ran for a school board trustee position in Ontario this past fall last year. And the website itself, which is I guess what I'm known for, is a shared policy platform for school board trustees, which tries to present a vision of what public education would look like if it was based on classical liberal values, as opposed to the sort of critical theory-based ideology that's sort of taken root in the system today, which includes gender identity, gender ideology as well. So I ran on this platform trying to, advertise some of these concerns. Now, the school board trustee races, of course, are over. I have chosen to keep the website up as a sort of an educational platform for parents and other, concerned citizens, because it has continued to receive actually a lot of good feedback. And I have visibility on the metrics, the number of site visits per day, that sort of thing. So I know that even though I'm not actively advertising it or spending money to advertise it, we're still getting a lot of hits, so to speak. And it does go into some depth on topics pertaining to the impact of biological sex-based rights for women, which have been compromised badly, I would say, by gender ideology in the schools. It talks about school boards teaching gender ideology as part of the curriculum, and it also discusses the impact of gender-affirming policies within the schools and how that impacts students. So 3 topics that I think are timely for this discussion, and we can certainly get into the details of those as we move through the discussion today.
I'm looking forward to it. Is this website something that you've created for your campaign, or did you have any part of it existing before?
No, I created it for the campaign. Originally, it was intended for my own campaign, but as I began researching on social media, I realized very quickly there were a lot of other parents who had similar concerns to what I had. So I had the idea of developing a shared policy platform, which potentially anybody could run on if they were interested in running as a school board trustee candidate. And we did actually have a few people run on the platform. Some of whom I believe you might know Chanel Fell. She's probably one of the more famous high-profile individuals that ran on it. And there were other trustees that ran on, portions of the platform. It wasn't an all or nothing type deal. Individual trustees could select, what they liked and what they didn't like, and they could run on those portions accordingly. So a lot of trustees did express interest in the platform, and it was, we had some pretty good media attention from, some positive media attention from those news organizations which were supportive, and some not so positive media attention from organizations that were not so supportive. But that's all par for the course, I guess, in politics. So, but no, the site I think has proven to be quite useful, and I think it's still helping to get the message out about some of the damage that's being done by these policies in our schools.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, I'm happy to hear that. I can't wait to dive in. But before we do that, Karin, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Okay, well, I'm here today primarily because I'm a member of a fairly new group called Our Duty Canada, which was started about 6 months ago as a chapter of an organization that's existed a little longer already in the UK. It was started in the UK, and it's basically an organization that collectivizes parents who have a personal stake in the transgender issue. And in the UK, the group has done quite a lot in terms of, and as the name suggests, it's kind of the anti-Hallmark view on parents. It's about our responsibilities as opposed to about how much we love our kids, and the whole sort of just hoping that the passion that we bring to the topic will serve to assert our rights and preserve our place in our kids' lives and in community life. So the group's purpose is basically to provide support for parents and also to provide resources and be an active participant in the social conversation about transgender ideation. So the group being quite new, it's actually a really neat dovetail with what I've been doing for a lot longer than that. So my kids are way grown up, and they started school in the 1990s. And by the way, I'm in British Columbia. I'm in Vancouver. So our experience is maybe a little bit different from Ontario, but not that much. So when my kids started school and I became an active parent, I became quite quickly embroiled in what are known as the reading wars. And if you don't know what the reading wars are, it's basically that there's long since been knowledge within teaching about how to effectively teach reading and arithmetic and other things. Basically, it's the phonics approach, loosely put. But from within the system, from within teacher training academies, from within teachers' unions, from within administrative circles, even, there's always been this progressive push to be teaching a whole language, to be teaching the whole child, not just to be teaching a skill to the children, but to be expanding and basically to do dances with books rather than to actually teach reading. So I got it very embroiled in that and became particularly interested in what the role of parents really is relative to the school system. And I did just a ton of work on not only on teaching methods and on system design. I'm actually I'm a graduate of the Ivy MBA program and was a fairly recent graduate at that time. So I sort of tried to bring those skills to understanding what I was seeing going on in the education system. So it was really a 15, 20 year kind of course of personal study for me to understand why these systems were behaving the way they were when parent opinion and parent preference was quite clearly going in the opposite direction. So as this transgender thing started to emerge, those same behaviors those same patterns were on display. So we had the parents with certain specific preferences, and we had the system going in a completely opposite direction, and parents apparently helpless to influence what was actually being done, even though they have our kids, and as taxpayers, they have our money. And so it really, it snowballs into a whole interest in democratic systems and how they work, and public service and public sector unions and the whole thing. So this is a really natural fit for me in terms of taking what I've been butting my head against for 25 years and putting it to the parents who are discovering this particular issue right now.
So are you finding that there's a lot of interest over there? I know that British Columbia is kind of a nightmare when it comes to the school boards, and they're kind of picking up a reputation right now, certainly a reputation in Canada. I'm not sure whose reputation is worse, Ontario's or British Columbia's, but I know this reputation is probably going international as well. Do you find that a lot of parents are very interested in what you have to say and in all these reading wars that are going on?
Parents are interested. I mean, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is parents are always most interested when it really strikes them that it's impacted their child. The thing about the reading wars, and it's similar, I think, in transgenderism, is that you can almost teach reading, for example. I'll take that as an example, any way you want, and a third of the kids will learn to read anyway. A third of the kids will manage fairly well, and then the other third will fail catastrophically if you're not teaching effectively. And I think you can probably bring a similar notion to the issue of transgenderism. So you bring this transgender stuff into the classroom or into the school, and you probably have a third of kids who will just not be affected at all. And those parents obviously won't be too concerned because everything seems fine to them. And then you'll have another third of the kids who are disturbed in some way. And then you'll have the other third of kids who are really drawn in and badly, badly hurt. And, or the families are badly hurt, even if the kids don't think they're badly hurt. And so those parents obviously are highly conscious of what's going on. I mean, it's kind of interesting. When I was running as a trustee, of course, I got a few emails from people. And I was probably one of the most outspoken in terms of the clarity with which I stated that I was running to oppose transgender teaching. And so I got some pushback from parents, and fairly typical are parents whose kids are like 2 or 3 years old, even a little older than that, kindergarten. And they're saying, well, I totally support this stuff, and I'm raising my child to be tolerant. I hope she doesn't grow up like you. And what's really interesting is their obvious built-in assumption that their own child will not be affected by transgender ideology. Their child is going to be the one who's tolerant of the kids who are transgender. It doesn't dawn on them at all that their child is going to present with these beliefs. So they just don't think their children are at risk. And it's only when that happens, it's the group of parents who've been through that who really get it. And then there's another portion who are aware of the dangers, very much aware of the dangers. And then there's another group that's just oblivious.
Interesting. Yeah. Peter, what do you think? Are we dealing with these kinds of things in Ontario?
Oh, yes, very much so. So in Ontario, I mean, I would say, if we're comparing BC and Ontario, it's hard to say which province is more radical at the moment. I'm gonna suggest probably BC, but Ontario's a close second. So gender ideology is officially part of the Ontario sex ed curriculum. That's which, by the way, is determined by the provincial government. It's not determined by school boards. And it's supposed to be taught in grade 8. But what appears to be happening is that a lot of the teachers are incorporating it into lessons earlier than that, even though they're not technically obligated or required to do so, but they're doing it because they're essentially, let's say, true believers in the underlying ideology, and they feel that they're doing the right thing. I do find that there's a bit of a generational divide when it comes to teachers. The younger teachers that are coming out of the teachers' colleges are much more likely to be indoctrinated with this sort of thinking. And the older teachers who have been, let's say, around for a while, they've seen how things have developed. They're perhaps less likely, but again, the entire education system seems to have really incorporated these ideas. They call it equity, but it's equity for everybody. So they'll take the position that if you oppose or question any of the ideas around gender ideology, that you are potentially violating the human rights codes. And the school boards have weaponized the human rights codes against trustees. And we've seen this very recently with Linda Stone in Ontario. She was censured for raising concerns about the effects of gender-affirming medical care on young people. And that was quickly weaponized by other trustees on her board, and they've censured her now, I believe, for the rest of the year, if I'm not mistaken. So even though she's an elected representative, she's no longer able to attend meetings. She's no longer able to represent her constituents. She's essentially been canceled. And, you know, the thing that I would say, and this is one of my political frustrations with school boards in general, there's no other level of government where this would be tolerated. You know, municipal politics, provincial politics, or federal politics, you cannot cancel a member of the opposition in any sense. And if you could, you know, the democratic process would break down completely. But with school board trustees, apparently it's okay, which makes no sense whatsoever. But anyway, that's currently it's allowed by the Ontario Education Act. But getting back to gender, it is permitted in the Ontario Sex Ed curriculum to talk about gender identity in grade 8. It is happening earlier than that. Any parents that raise concerns about it are basically sidelined by the boards. They're saying, you know, this is a human rights issue, it's an equity issue, end of story. And, you know, they seem to be disregarding the evidence. This is what concerns me personally, is that the evidence of harm to young people by gender-affirming care is increasing all the time. We've seen countries in Europe that are moving away from the Dutch model, affirming model. The UK has moved radically away from it. I believe Sweden and Finland as well. But in Canada, we're sort of stuck in this mindset that we have to affirm no matter what. And whether it's social affirmation in schools or medical affirmation, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how young the child is. Doesn't matter what parents want. And the schools are essentially becoming complicit in this. And it also puts teachers, I would say, in a bit of a difficult position as well, because teachers are not therapists. They're not qualified to be making psychiatric evaluations of students. They're just being told that you must, as a condition of your employment, you must affirm, you must use a student's preferred pronouns. You must use whatever name they tell you, and you don't get to tell the parents. If you do tell the parents, you could lose your job. So I mean, it's a complete absurdity. First of all, that teachers are put in this position. Number two, that they're not allowed to tell the parents. I mean, that there's no excuse for hiding secrets from a child's parents under any circumstance, in my opinion. But that is the way things are currently in the schools, and again, it's all justified by these equity initiatives and by this perception that nothing in the Human Rights Code is beyond dispute or above dispute. So anybody who challenges that or in any way, shape, or form is essentially censured or sidelined. So I'd say the situation in Ontario is quite bad for school board trustees, and I don't think it's much better in BC, to be honest.
I know that in BC, there's something called the SOGI program, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, SOGI 123. I know that in Ontario, we don't have SOGI, or at least it's not explicit, but we actually do have SOGI in a way. The director of our school board said that gender orientation and sexual preference is not part of the school curriculum. And he's absolutely right. And like you said as well, so my daughters are in elementary school and I did not see it, yet this stuff is talked about all the time in classes and at school, and there's books on this topic. So it seems to me like they are able to add on to the curriculum as they see fit, and then avoid responsibility by saying, well, it's not in the curriculum, and parents, because it's not in the curriculum, they don't really see it written down anywhere. So they don't really have that gotcha moment, because they can always say, well, this is our curriculum. We just teach what's in the curriculum. But the truth is that they don't teach what's in the curriculum. And we've had surveys in the school that solicited kids. It said grade 4 and up, but the actual survey was age 4 and up. And the school board did not release the surveys. They did an open letter to my delegation talking about the surveys, but it was very disappointing that they were not transparent in this manner. I've also covered the policies in this. And the director said that students are at high risk of depression and suicide. And I cannot believe that we have a group of students, high risk depression and suicide. What is the excuse of keeping this information from parents? This is all backwards to me. There's absolutely no excuse. And for the life of me, I cannot understand.
I'll pick up a couple of threads out of that. The first is about the curriculum, and you're quite right that the curriculum is almost it's almost designed to be kind of a bait and switch. And one of the things I discovered, it's actually kind of pathetic, I would almost say, that I had been doing sort of activism in schools for probably 15 years before I really understood the degree to which a lot of the decisions a lot of the battles are fought in court. So I had been at parent-teacher meetings. I had been at school board committee meetings. I had watched school board meetings. I'd been talking to reporters, and stuff had been covered in the press. I did not understand that the forces that I was fighting against were, in fact, while I was busy arguing in parent-teacher meetings, they were in court, and they were establishing their turf, so to speak, with the judge's approval, and in cases with parents not even being represented. So, for example, there was a case about whether teachers could use parent-teacher interviews. No, whether teachers could use parent-teacher interviews to present information about their union's politics, basically, which sometimes it's kind of couched as a strike, sometimes it's just straight up politics, and the court actually ruled, without hearing from a single parent or a single delegation of parents, the court ruled that the teachers could indeed use parent-teacher interviews in that way, which to me is absolutely staggering. And one of the reasons that they get away with that is that we're just not even aware of that dimension. And on the topic of curriculum, there's a very important case that took place in, I think, the late 1980s. And anytime you talk about curriculum as a parent, you'll get this case cited at you, which is that there was, I think it was that there was a teacher strike. In any event, a father went to court and said, this teacher didn't teach this part of the curriculum, and therefore so I had to do some tutoring, so I want the money for my tutoring expenses from the school district. And the court ruled that, in fact, the teacher does not have to teach the curriculum. And this case, it's called Haynes versus Larry's, and Larry's is L-L-E-R-E-S. And the case is not even, this is really interesting. In law, there are published and unpublished cases. This is even an unpublished case. So as a parent, you can't just go look it up on the internet. You have to go to your local law library and get somebody to pull it for you. And indeed, that's the finding. And as a parent, of course, you don't have the resources to appeal that. So that was a lower court decision, and it stood. So the curriculum has these two features. One is the teachers do not have to teach what's in the curriculum. And the other, as you say, David, they can teach it even if it's not in the curriculum. So the curriculum is a guide. And there's another layer to that I think a lot of parents don't know about. And that is the learning resources that go along with the curriculum. So you have the curriculum has certain sections to it. And then you have lesson plans and sample worksheets and classroom displays and whatever else. And a lot of those are actually put out by the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions have a very strong official role of producing these learning resources. In BC, they run the professional development programs. And so and one of the interesting threads that comes out of those learning resources is not just stuff like transgender ideology, but there's a very distinct, because one of the interesting things about transgender ideology is that there's a strong parent alienation component. So it's part of the appeal, I think, to kids is that it emotionally emancipates you from your parents. You get to reject your parents. And so the interesting thing is to look back over the teaching resources that I've seen over the decades and see how often parents are sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly vilified and put down and ridiculed in these resources in a way that is really not acceptable. So kids have been getting lessons for ages already about how your parents are kind of they need you to guide them based on what your teacher now tells you. So putting all that together, you really are very much at the mercy of the teacher's own choices, and the teacher's choices are shaped in part by how they were trained in their university training programs, and then by the ongoing material that they get from their unions. So that's the main thing. I actually have now forgotten what the second point was out of what you said that I was going to address, but it'll come back to me. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries, Peter. In regards to this kind of way out of taking responsibility where they have their curriculum, but they also can teach from something else. How do you break this circular cycle of not being able to take responsibilities? Because during the board meetings, and Karin, by the way, this is the disrespect between parents and the school board. All you have to do is turn on your local board meeting and just watch. Like, this stuff is not even hidden anymore. It's not subtle anymore. It's right up in the front. So Peter, I've been seeing the school boards just pointing fingers. They point fingers to the Ministry of Education on their approved books. They also say, talk to the principal. I've been confirmed by the principal and librarians that they have no power to remove the books in the library on topics, sexually explicit material topics. And everybody's just pointing fingers and nobody's taking responsibility. What do you think about this?
Well, so first of all, I'd say that there is unfortunately an adversarial relationship now between parents and these boards of education. And I'm seeing that, across multiple school boards. I think it's a symptom, really, of the underlying sort of culture that's taken over the education system in general. Parents are anybody that opposes if you'll excuse the word, the woke curriculum, is considered an enemy, essentially. So if that's parents, then so be it. Now, to be fair to the school boards, and this is where it gets a bit contentious, because most parents that have issues with their children's schools will immediately go to their school boards and they'll complain. The school boards are correct on a couple of points here. Number one, the curriculum is set by the Ministry of Education, and that is a provincial government function. And I think, frankly, the provincial government needs to be getting a lot more anger directed at it than it is, because the provincial government does set the curriculum. And they have implemented a lot of legislation, which is essentially tying the hands of trustees when it comes to equity issues and, the rules are under which school boards operate. And they've allowed a lot of things to happen, which have, constituted, again, I've mentioned this before, but silencing trustees. That only happens because of it's permitted to happen under the legislation of the Education Act. So I think a lot of anger needs to be directed not just at the school boards, but more, frankly, at the provincial government, at least in Ontario. Ironically, we have a progressive conservative government at the moment. You wouldn't know it. But, when the schools say, we have to do this because it's a legislative requirement, they're not wrong, right? I mean, they do have to comply with the law, and the curriculum is what it is, so they have to comply. They have to teach the curriculum. Now, to Karin's point, that they're not restricted to the curriculum, and it seems that some of the teachers get a little bit creative in terms of how they implement the curriculum, let's say, within their own classroom, and some of them will, conveniently enough, add things that they would like to add, and whether or not the parents are on board seems to be largely irrelevant. Now, in terms of how we break the cycle of that, I mean, that's a tough one because honestly, I don't see any mechanism other than through legal action at this point. You can try to take over school boards if you can find enough people that are ideologically like-minded that would challenge the status quo. That would be in a position to win a school board. Well, that's more challenging. It's easier said than done. But even if you could, one of the things I've found is that the legislation effectively ties your hands. You're severely limited. A lot of people don't realize just school board trustees don't really have that much power at the end of the day. Not anywhere near other types of politicians. They're actually quite limited in what they can do. For example, they can't fire teachers. They can't fire superintendents. Typically, the only person that they could fire would be the director of education. And then in theory, I suppose you could replace the director of education with somebody that was more like-minded. And then that director in turn could clean house within the lower managerial ranks of a given board. But obviously that gets into, the unions will be fighting you tooth and nail on that. There'll be a whole lot of nasty politics and nasty media attention. So I really don't see any option other than legal action to raise some of these concerns. And again, that is expensive, first of all, and there's no guarantee of success. And you've got to be able to make a strong legal case as to why you're right. And, your mileage may vary. That's maybe the best way to put it. But that's the state of things at the moment.
I'm very surprised with the material too that they have in the schools. And, I was going through some of the sexual misconduct cases, and the threshold for that, I have a podcast that I'll be releasing tomorrow with Pierre Barnes, and some teachers, they got a sexual misconduct case for simply playing music with sexual themes in there. Now it seems like in the school we are way beyond this threshold where we have books and we are exceeding the requirements for criminal code. We got audio, visual, we got all sorts of crazy things. It's like in a movie, if you have a kid's movie, but with the sex scene, suddenly it's rated 18 plus, but in schools, you can have a book and then you can have some sex scene or some crazy scene, and they're okay with having that in school. And if you're in the workplace and you're talking about sexual things, it's considered workplace harassment, but in the education system, it's actually preferred. And I don't know who's interested in knowing the sexuality of kids. They're definitely pressing this hard. They're soliciting minors to disclose. Their teachers are talking about their sexuality in front of children. And children, at least my children, are not sexual. They're small children. They don't know. And if I did see a child that was sexual and knew their sexual preferences, I would get some serious red flags on what's going on with that child.
Yeah. Well, let me comment on that because, again, this is another one of these contentious issues, these surveys that school boards are doing to gather identity information on their student populations and also on their staff. Again, to be fair to the school boards, they're actually required to do this by legislation passed by the Ontario government. Now, this is why I again say that, if you want to be angry at somebody, point your anger at the provincial government because they're the ones that are actually mandating schools to do this, school boards to do this. It is absolutely absurd to be asking, a grade 4 student about their sexual orientation. Most of them haven't even hit puberty yet, so they're not going to have a slightest clue. But the fact is, the school boards are mandated by the provincial government to collect this identity information, and they're doing it basically to address equity concerns. And this is another issue that I have with this whole idea of collecting this type of information, is that it's based on the theory that if you don't have equitable outcomes among all these different potential groups in society, whether it's based on race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender or what have you, the only possible explanation is systemic racism or systemic sexism or something along these lines, some structural issue. And this is an ideological idea which completely disregards a whole slew of variables that can impact inequitable outcomes, or equitable outcomes, however you want to put it. But this is why I don't think it's a good idea to be collecting this information to begin with, because it's basically used to justify all sorts of policies that are going on in the schools, which are supposedly geared toward addressing inequality. But in practice, what they're doing is really making inequality worse, at least in my view. We're seeing a collapse of academic standards. We're seeing a collapse of disciplinary standards in the schools. A lot of school-place violence is happening as well. It's becoming quite, frankly, I pity some of the teachers and the EAs that work in these environments. They have almost no recourse, if a student misbehaves. They've done away with the school resource officer programs, at least in Ontario. I think they're bringing them back in BC, from what I've heard, so that's a good thing. But the whole practice of collecting all this information is to allow them to justify continuing these programs, these programs to improve equity. But that doesn't justify it. To your point, David, it doesn't justify asking little kids about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Again, these are abstract concepts to any child that hasn't hit puberty. It's an absurdity, but that's what they're doing. But don't blame the school boards for that. Blame the provincial government.
I'm also seeing this justification play out no matter what the survey results. The end result is to continue doing more of it. For example, if they poll kids and they find that they're getting, let's say, a low number of a certain group of kids, then they say, well, we need to continue to expose these kids to the material because we need to make them more aware. However, if they get a high number of kids, then they say, well, we need to continue doing what we're doing so we can get the results that we want. So no matter what they do, it's just a justification to continue. Whether the numbers are too low, we need to increase, or if the numbers are good, then we keep going. Karin, how did you find that this stuff plays out in real life? Because I'm finding it very difficult to be in a position of the school board essentially advocating for the trans ideology, where these kids are led down a path of medical lifelong ramifications, whether it's physical or mental, with ramifications such as sterilization, before you even have the opportunity to start a family or to think about it. And I find like these matters are very trivialized early on, like it's going to be okay. This is kind of what you were meant to be, etc. Can you tell me a little bit from your part?
Well, I think one of the things that's becoming more clear is that it's one of these debates where facts don't really matter. If you do go into facts with people, they are so buffered by their belief system that they can either justify, rationalize, deny. If you talk about it, you can't. It's almost as if we have to address not the details of this insane ideology that the system insiders are promoting, but rather what we have to address is why these system insiders have the power to take all our kids in the direction of insanity, when the rest of us are quite happy in insanity. So the I don't quite know how to answer your question, except to say that it's really easy to get drawn into these details. And I mean, one of my weaknesses, unfortunately, has been on to participate a lot on Twitter, and which I think I've been doing now for 10 years. So I've had countless conversations with people about stuff that we disagree on, from within the education trenches on things like reading and arithmetic to this transgender ideology. And people simply have these, or even teacher unionism is the other thing. And I think from so I also bring kind of a systems analysis to it. And then there's another kind of an emerging body of knowledge, which is, there's a guy, he's on Twitter as Rob K. Henderson, and he probably epitomizes this. And there are a few others where it's this body of knowledge about human behavior, and specifically about human behavior in groups, and how, and then when you get power dynamics, power differentiation between groups. So you have a more powerful group that has sort of access to resources that other people would like to have or don't have. And all of these dynamics are playing out really obviously now. And one of the reasons they're so obvious is because they play out also on Twitter. So there was a really astute observation made by Jonathan Kay a while ago about how media, how the people in the press interact on Twitter, where they've become sort of a self-managing. It's almost like they're performing for each other rather than worried about how they're doing their jobs. And so to address the dynamics of how the press is covering this issue, for example, one has to appreciate the group behavioral incentives that are acting on them. So now when a reporter writes a story about, for example, what an awful person is running for trustee because they don't believe in transgender ideology, all the other reporters like and retweet that. And they gain status in the little group because they hate these transphobes. And so the way to get around that is not to try to address them on the topic, because they're not capable of thinking on the topic at all. They're thinking on the basis of how they maintain their status and position in their group, whether within their workplace or within the community of reporters overall. And that's so much the case within the school system as well. I mean, you can go in and you can talk to a teacher till you're blue, or to a principal about, how dangerous it is to tell a 14-year-old something that will lead to her choosing to be sterile by the time she's 18. But none of that will matter to the person, because they know they can't say anything. They know they can't say it in the staff room. They know they can't say it in the union hall. They know they can't say it in their, alumni group or anywhere else. They know that they'll get, canceled, for lack of a better word. And so in a way, it's almost, I think, smarter to straight up address the power dynamics than it is to try to argue whether or not it's smart to sterilize a 14-year-old. I mean, it's dumb to sterilize a 14-year-old. Clearly, I mean, the stupidity of it is beyond obvious, unless you belong to this little insider group that almost has, where the condition of entry, the condition of belonging, is almost to believe in this improbable notion. There's some great writing on that topic. There was actually a really good article. I just tweeted it yesterday, I think, sometime, about how even the more intelligent people are, the more likely they are to believe in these improbable things. They rationalize in a way that makes them feel special for believing them, or something like that. I'm misquoting. I read it quite quickly, but it's great literature on sort of the behavioral front that I think gives us way more leverage about how to combat it than finding the weaknesses in their argument, because there's nothing but weaknesses in their argument, right?
Yeah, I really find, that only an intellectual can come up with such justifications for such poor behavior. Like you really gotta be smart to trick yourself into thinking that this stuff is okay. Peter, I don't know if you have anything to add about that. I know you wanted to say something right before.
I'm gonna get you to repeat the question, just so I'm commenting on the right thing.
Yeah. So just on the topic of transgenderism, and actually, as Karin was saying, when you try to debate this topic head on, even though the answers are very obvious, as you ran for trustee, what did you find actually? How was your support? Seems like a lot of trustees that went along with this crazy ideology are the ones that came out on top. Now, I'm happy to say that there's a few trustees that are still in the school boards, and I think they're having a hard time because they're overwhelmed. What do you think about this? How did these trustees who are supporting gender ideology gather all the support to be elected?
Oh, well, that's fairly easy because they have the support of the teachers' unions, fundamentally. So basically what happens with school board elections, well, let's start with municipal politics. This has the lowest voter turnout of any type of election, period. And even within the context of municipal elections, even fewer people vote for school board trustees as opposed to municipal councilors. The people that are most likely to vote in municipal elections tend to be the elderly, by a significant margin over the younger generations. They are unfortunately also the least likely to know what's going on in the public schools, just because they don't have kids in the schools anymore. And the other issue is that the people that are most likely to vote for school board trustees in general are people that have a personal stake, either themselves or maybe through a family member in public education. So, of course, that means all the teachers' unions, QP as well, and anybody that's anyways affiliated with public education is going to vote. And those unions took a very strong stance in favor of trustees who were supportive of gender ideology. And again, this goes back to the sort of the union mentality that we're fighting for equality, right? So doesn't matter what that equality is about. So whether it's socioeconomic or based on group identity, they don't make any distinction. So all the unions unofficially I seem to encourage their members to vote for trustees that were running on in support of gender ideology, among other things. I would have to say that a lot of the candidates are affiliated, at least in Ontario, with the provincial NDP. And that didn't seem to hurt them either. I'll give some credit to the NDP; they're quite well organized, although they're not supposed to get involved in municipal politics. But who knows what goes on behind the scenes? So it's not surprising to me that they won. I don't think it was so much because of their position on gender ideology. I think it's just because they had the support of the unions, essentially.
How does the union affect the trustee? How does this play out in real life? Do they advocate for them, or how does it work?
Well, I would say unofficially, I believe they do. So the unions have certain rules that they're supposed to follow as well. During a municipal election, school boards are not allowed to publicly advocate for any trustee candidate. So if you're working for a school board, you're supposed to, at least in theory, stay out of the electoral process. The unions, I believe, I'm not entirely clear if that rule applies to the unions, the teachers' unions, or not. But in practice, what we were finding was that the teachers' unions are quite active, for example, on Twitter and other forms of social media, basically encouraging their membership to quote unquote look closely, at the platforms of trustees and vote very carefully, or words to that effect. And you could kind of tell, where they were going with this. They were trying to encourage their membership to vote for trustees that the union supported, which isn't surprising. But the unions seemed to feel, I don't know if they felt threatened by the trustees that were running on these sort of anti-woke platforms, but they seemed to be taking the position that if you were not supportive of teaching gender ideology in the classroom, that the only possible reason for that was that you were essentially transphobic. And the unions, of course, are promoting the message of equality across the board, regardless of what type of equality we're talking about. So they on principle opposed the anti-woke trustees, and I think that had actually a huge influence on the outcome of the election. In fact, I think it was probably the deciding factor.
Are the trustees allowed to band together? Let's say this group of trustees, we're all going to kind of team up and everybody's going to market for themselves, but also as a group. So if one gets elected, everybody else kind of gets elected. Are they allowed to do that? Or do you have to just advocate for yourself only?
You have to run independently.
Okay.
So, you can have a group of trustees running on similar platforms that might support each other, obviously, if they get elected, and we see that all the time. But during the race, you have to manage your own finances, you have to manage your own campaign, you have to run essentially as an independent individual, at least in Ontario anyway.
There's a school board in BC that's kind of raising some eyebrows, Chilliwack School District. Karin, I'm sure you're probably familiar. Now, I've seen on social media the chair, when she was running for trustee, it seemed like she had a few other trustees that made it to the board. And the reason I'm asking this is it seems like they were all kind of advocating for each other. They probably had the individual platforms, as you were saying, Peter, but then they were all very closely linked in reality. So
yeah,
I found that very interesting.
I'm actually not quite sure whether. So first of all, in BC, we have in most municipalities we have an at-large system. In Ontario, you have far more wards. So you've got people who are running to be the trustee for such and such a district or area within the school district. We don't have a lot of that. So for the most part, we do tend to form municipal parties, just because we're campaigning to a much larger area. So, for example, when I ran in Vancouver, I was running in all of Vancouver, and in Chilliwack, I believe it's the same, and there was at least one slate that was running together in Chilliwack. And I don't know if the chair of the board at this time, I don't know if she was running with a slate or on her own. But certainly one thing that the unions do in BC is they actively endorse certain candidates. So they'll I don't know how far it goes, but they do, they make it very clear who they want to see in. And then but aside from the elections, because one of the points Peter made is quite true, that teachers preferentially vote in elections, because teachers in in school board elections specifically. So I would venture to say that all teachers, probably 90% of teachers vote, whereas probably 15% of ordinary people do, who don't know as much about what's going on in the school system. So I think the more the more important, partly because it's a bit of a cakewalk for the union to get elected who they want to see elected. I think one of the more important things that they do is they track school board politics really carefully, and they let trustees know what positions they want to see advanced. So for example, and the way that the unions are organized, and I'm pretty sure, I think it's the same in Ontario. So we have the BC Teachers Federation, which is the umbrella organization for the whole province. And then we have local teachers unions, which are affiliated with the BC Teachers Federation. In Ontario, you're organized by elementary and secondary, and also you've got your Catholic union. But I think the principle is the same, that you have a provincial organization that has these local affiliates. So the local affiliates basically do the work of watching their school board affairs. And my guess would be there's probably never a school board meeting that happens without a teachers union representative actually in attendance. And they write letters to the trustees about the issues that come up. If a trustee wants to make a motion, for example, they have to do like a notice of motion in advance, or they submit it one meeting, it gets voted on the next meeting. So the union has plenty of time to make sure that all of its captive trustees know very well what the union's opinion is and what the arguments are and what should be on the record and what shouldn't be on the record. And they stage manage the thing pretty carefully.
Interesting. So you've mentioned that the union pushes for certain things to move forward. In regarding to gender ideology, I've never thought that we're going to get to this point. If we keep this up, where do you see, what are the next steps that they're looking to push?
Yeah, that's a tough one. If I'm looking at the gender activists themselves, then I am seeing, I'm seeing certainly a reduction in the stigma, in sort of the significance of age in sexual relations, whether it's reducing the age lowering the age of consent, or sort of destigmatizing relationships between adults and kids. This whole love is love and love knows no limits and all that stuff just has really strong pedophiliac connotations. And I think it's becoming pretty clear that they don't have a lot of respect for the boundaries of childhood. If I'm talking about the union specifically, I have to be honest and say I am not quite sure where they want to see it go. I'd have to give that some thought. That's a good question.
Peter, what do you think?
It is a good question. What I'm generally seeing at a high level with the entire public education system is this, increasingly there's this mentality where I would describe it as anything goes. And people in any position of authority seem increasingly reluctant to set standards of any sort and to raise objections that might be based on, traditional notions of what considered proper behavior or proper social custom or etiquette. And, they seem to be doing that almost out of a sense of paralysis and fear of essentially being yelled at, for lack of a better way to put it, and potentially having to deal with a public uproar if they say or do the wrong thing. But the problem with that is that when you start relaxing all of these standards in the schools, if we get into this mentality where anything goes, then, well, first of all, the dress codes go. They've already done away with dress codes for many of the school boards, so the students can, for the most part, wear almost anything they want. The one thing that I would add, in addition to what Karin just mentioned, there's a certain subculture, I think is referred to as furries, where people dress up as animals, essentially, and it seems to be associated with people, for whatever reason. I don't automatically understand why, but it's associated with the LGBTQ kind of broader subculture. And I want to be fair because I know a lot of people who are LGB who are completely opposed to this kind of nonsense, and many of them who oppose gender ideology as well. And I don't think it's fair to lump all these people together in one group, which is what sometimes happens. I don't personally have issues myself with sexual orientation as an issue, but I do think that this tendency to become increasingly tolerant and refuse to raise concerns about any type of subculture within our society is showing up in the schools. And I can see potentially in 10 years' time, maybe less than that, where things will be permitted today, or at that time that maybe still would be considered questionable today, one of which might be allowing students to come to school dressed in all sorts of crazy costumes because they identify as animals or comic book characters or anime characters or who knows what, and nobody wants to challenge their quote unquote identity because identity is suddenly seemingly the be all and end all of sort of the way the left wing is currently seeing the world. So they're almost willing to allow anything to go, no matter how absurd. And the inevitable outcome of that is that we will see, as much as I hate to say it, there will be attacks on the notion of age as being a limiting factor in adult-children relationships. It's only, I think, a matter of time. And I think we'll see increasingly absurd, situations with furries and God knows what else they'll come up with in the next 10 years. But it's a symptom, I think, of an underlying problem with our entire culture, which is sort of this postmodern idea that, all ideas are equal and anything goes, and anybody that raises objections is just doing so from a position of power and oppression, which is, the sort of critical theory-based thinking, which is so damaging to our society and to our schools. It destroys professionalism, it destroys discipline, it destroys academic standards, and it leaves essentially chaos in its wake. It just takes time to roll out. And I think this has been going on for decades. We're now really starting to see the fruition of it in our public schools. And in the short term, I don't see it getting any better. I think it's going to get worse.
Well, you always know who's in power because those people are the ones silencing everybody else. And it's very interesting to see the people in power are the ones saying, we're fighting for the oppressed, while anybody that speaks out against just the most insane behavior, like I said, like sterilizing minors and soliciting minors for sexual things, having conversations, disclosing their sexuality to minors, having books to educate minors, saying that this is human right. So let's say best case scenario, this sexual, it is a protected human right. That does not give somebody protection to say, well, sexuality is a human right, therefore I can just have sex with a minor. I think they're trying to lower the age of consent so they can make the two fit together. The terms that I've been hearing is minor attracted people, which is kind of the more sympathetic term for pedophiles. And a new term that's emerging is adults attracted minors. So they're trying to also make the children seem like they want to consent, they want this. And of course, this is all part of the child abuse, saying we know what's better, it's okay. And it's very disturbing. All right, as we wrap this up, Karin, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to, you said the word power, and that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking, okay, what is the union's objective specifically? Always, and it is always about access to the children, getting the parents out of the way, and it is always about money. You never hear the union talk about anything that doesn't generate some sort of a rationale for increasing education funding, and so, in a way, the more troubled the children are, the more specialists they need to have, the smaller class sizes they can argue for, the more the more specialized services they bring in, the more they can aggrandize what teachers have to do, so that they can push for higher salaries for teachers, which of course generate higher union dues. There's a number of ways that a more troubled child population will benefit the union financially and in terms of power. So the union always wants to be able to control the government. They always want to be able to control the school board, because that in turn also will allow them to send, siphon more resources off of the system. So it is always about detaching kids from their parents, causing difficulties, and then increasing the size of their empire to allegedly solve those difficulties, which of course they never do.
So they create the problems and then they say, we will bring in the solutions to these problems.
Yeah, and that's the lesson of the reading wars too, is that they know darn well it's absolutely not rocket science to teach every single grade 1 child how to read in grade 1, at a pinch in grade 2. But why on earth do we have grade 11s and 12s who are barely functionally literate? Well, we have that because somebody is on purpose making sure that they are not learning to read. And the math is, if you teach every child in grade 1 to read, you need X number of full-time equivalent teachers to get them through to grade 12. If you can avoid teaching them to read in grade 1, then in grade 2, you need an extra teacher's aide. In grade 3, they're starting to act out. You need 2 extra teacher's aide, and you need a vice principal. In grade 5 and grade 7, it just adds up. And in high school, you need half a dozen special programs for the various needs the complex needs that these kids who are, they're somehow trying to survive in the system without being able to read. So obviously, you need various special programs to accommodate how they've adapted to their situation. So you can double, triple, quadruple your staffing, the staffing component that you are arguing for, if the kids can't read. And so it may be overly simplistic, given that we're also talking about medical harm here being done to these kids, and it involves the medical system. But if you're asking what the teachers union is after, it's almost intrinsically harming kids one way or the other, and it's stopping teachers from doing their jobs, ironically.
Mm-hmm.
I'd add a bit to that. I think it's important just to highlight that, there's a lot of excellent teachers out there who are doing a great job. They're opposed to what's happening in the classroom. Unfortunately, they don't have the power to change it. And with respect to the teachers' unions, I think the leadership of the unions is sort of ideologically captured. And if I was one of those teachers, or if I was speaking to one of those teachers, or by any chance any of them are listening to this podcast, I would be encouraging them to, at the earliest opportunity, look at opportunities to change the leadership of the unions, to try to create an environment in the schools that is more likely to lead to better academic standards, better disciplinary standards, moving away from sort of the absurdities that we're seeing in the classroom that we've talked about on this podcast already. This is good for teachers. It's good for parents. It helps to eliminate, or at least reduce, that sort of adversarial mentality that we see sometimes today. So, I would appeal to teachers to reevaluate what their unions are doing, and to the extent that the unions are willing to change, I think that they don't have to necessarily be afraid of trustees that are, taking a different ideological view. Doesn't mean we're going to come after anybody's job, but I think ultimately it creates a safer work environment and a better work environment for both teachers and EAs and all administration and maintenance staff and everybody who works within the school system. And of course, if we actually care about the students, which we all claim to do, then this is the best way forward. So I would encourage teachers to look at other platforms. I'm well aware of what you're taught in professional development classes. there are other points of view, and other points of view do have merit. So I would just leave it at that as sort of a closing remark for my part.
If you were to recommend an action item to a parent that they could do right now, what would you recommend that is the most effective if they could focus for 5 minutes or a day or whatever, just to get something out of the way to help make an impact?
Write a letter to your MPP. Not your school board trustee, write a letter to your MPP, because and again, I've highlighted this before, it's really the provincial government that has passed a lot of the legislation that is tying school boards' hands. Now, the school boards don't seem to mind having their hands tied because they're quite on board with what they're being asked to do. But the fact of the matter is they're legally required to comply with the legislation from the Ministry of Education. And if you want to oppose the teaching of gender ideology in the classroom, first of all, you should be able to make a good case as to why. And, some people will oppose it on religious grounds, some people maybe on political grounds. I would oppose it personally based on the medical harm that it leads children to if they go down that road. And I think that's the strongest case we have with politicians. I think that case will become stronger as more and more people detransition. And, more and more stories come out in the media and perhaps lawsuits against medical providers that are doing this somewhat irresponsibly, I would say. So that case may be easier to make as time goes on, but do write a letter to your MPP and outline these concerns. And if you can take 5-10 minutes to do that, I don't mean an email, I mean a written letter. And better yet, if you can get in front of their face and actually speak to them in their office, that has a more substantial impact as well. And the other thing that I would highlight is encourage your MPP to contact the Minister of Education, Ontario's Stephen Leachy, I think his name is. And we have to change the way the rules are run for school boards, essentially. We cannot have a system where school board trustees can be canceled. It's undemocratic, and that has to change one way or another.
Right. Karin, what do you think?
I would certainly concur with lobbying at the provincial level. The reality is that the power dynamics are complicated, and I would say that there are two levels at which we need to exercise our ability to walk away from the system. One is that parents actually three levels. Parents need to be able to pull their kids. I think that if I were strong, I know how hard it is to pull your child out of public school. It's so easy to send them, and it's very difficult to do anything other than that, whether it's private school, whether it's homeschooling, or whether it is some sort of learning pod arrangement, which, by the way, I'll just mention quickly that there is an organization called Learning Pods Canada, which is looking into different ways of supporting non-schooling options. So there's really nothing more powerful that you can do as a parent than pulling out your child. But as both taxpayers and parents, we do need to start looking at asserting our legal rights. We have a very passive attitude about our institutional actors. We keep thinking people will somehow or another do the right thing. But they won't. They won't do it unless they're strongly incentivized. And the only way they'll be incentivized is if they lose access to the kids or if they lose access to the money. So as taxpayers because the system is accountable to taxpayers, not just to parents, we need to start asserting our legal rights in court, which is, as Peter said, expensive, difficult, but it is something that needs to be done. But the third level of choice that I think, again, Peter's point about teachers is well taken. There are a lot of teachers who know that what's going on in schools is counterproductive for kids and for everybody. And I think teachers need to start demanding some options. Teachers need to start walking away from their unions somehow. They're required by law to be members, but maybe they need to start asserting their legal rights in that regard too. The proof of what unions will stoop to is there in the history, and I think teachers need to do more than just step up to leadership, because I don't know that the internal dynamics of the unions are very well developed. They're very good at maintaining internal order, and I think teachers need to look at forming alternative organizations and trying to get them certified. So I think everybody needs to. I actually wanted to hold this up. It's a book that was written in 1970 called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And these are the 3 forms of response that people can exercise in response to declining organizations. We can either exit, that's the most powerful one. We can stay, and we can discuss, and we can articulate our opinions, which we've been doing since time immemorial. Or we can just stick it out and pretend we like it. And so it's the mix of how people choose those options. And there's so few people choosing exit that the system is not yet aware, the people who run the system are not yet aware that they need to market the system to us and meet our needs.
Thank you so much, Karin. Before I let you go, one last thing. Is there something that you wanted to say that I did not ask that you wanted to put out there? Karin, if you want to go first.
It's caught me by surprise. Off the top of my head, I think I want to say that there's a very interesting difference between or a characteristic of parents, which is that we don't tend to have a group identity. In fact, we don't even have really group legal rights in the way that so many other stakeholders in the system do. So it's a time, I think, when parents do need to organize. So for parents whose kids are drawn into the transgender ideation, I will mention again that the group that I'm here on behalf of, Our Duty Canada, is a valuable source of support and resources, and will also enable us to bring a collective voice to the battle. But there are lots of groups organizing. There are again, Peter mentioned at the beginning that there's groups organizing around defending women's spaces, and a lot of these are segments of society where we have not traditionally organized. We just kind of do our own thing. We plod along as individuals. It's a good time to get together with other people and undertake things collectively.
Well said. Peter, is there anything that you want to say that we haven't talked about?
Since we've been talking about the impact of gender ideology in the schools, I would just say to parents that are being impacted by this, you're not alone. Unfortunately, there are other parents that are dealing with the same challenges. And groups like Our Duty Canada are looking, I think, for membership, and they're new, but I think they have the potential to have a big influence on the public discussion. So that's something to look at. The other thing that I would highlight is on the blueprintforcanada.ca site, we have a resources section, which has, among other things, it has a detailed breakdown of many different groups and websites that are dealing with gender ideologies, sex-based rights for women, and gender affirmation policies and the impact of those. So there's a significant number of groups that are listed on that page that are worth taking a look at, and those groups in turn have additional resources, and some of them are extremely well developed. Many of them are Canadian. We also have a number of US and UK based groups that are highlighted on that particular resources page. So I'd encourage anybody that's looking for information or needs help, let's say, to look at some of those resources, particularly if you're in Canada. And I'm sure Our Duty Canada, I know, has a website as well. Karin, what is the website? I can't remember the address.
If you go to ourduty.group, It's sort of a parent website. Parent, I keep using that in the double entendre sense. It's the umbrella website, and it has links to the different countries. There's chapters in Australia, and there's 2 in the US, and there's the Canadian chapter, as well as the UK.
The last thing I'd say is just do get involved, because the more people that we have getting actively involved in these issues, the stronger we'll be, and the faster change will happen.
Absolutely. Well, to all the viewers and listeners that have stuck around, all the links will be in the description of the YouTube video from what Peter and Karin had talked about, to the different groups and where you can reach them on social media. I really want to encourage all parents to look into it, to reach out for more information if required, and to participate. The tide is turning, and it seems like people are paying attention. If you are interested in this conversation, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I have 3 other podcast episodes out, and I go through the policies and procedures, practices that the school boards have in place, and that affects the child's education. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Karin, for joining me on this podcast. And to everybody, see you next time.